thousands of worlds. They had seen civilizations rise and fall, watched species crumble under their might, and witnessed entire planetary populations kneeling before them in submission. Humanity, they believed, would be no different. Commander Varrock stood on the bridge of his battleship, the Eternal Dominion, gazing at the blue-green planet spinning below. Earth, he scoffed. The humans had only just begun to scratch the surface of interstellar travel. Their weapons were crude, their technology outdated, and their tactics primitive. This wouldn't be a war. It would be a message, a warning to any other species foolish enough to resist the Xelari. Scan their defenses, Varrock ordered. The holographic display flickered to life, showcasing Earth's orbital defenses, satellites, outdated missile systems, and a few scattered space stations. Pathetic. It was almost laughable. Commander, one of his officers said, barely containing a smirk, their planet is unprotected. Their strongest weapons wouldn't even scratch our hull. Varrock nodded, unimpressed. The humans had to know they were doomed. Perhaps that was why they had not responded to the ultimatum. He had given them a standard cycle to surrender, yet no transmission had come from Earth, no desperate pleas for mercy. No white flag, just silence. How long until our forces are in position? Varrock asked. The fleet is ready, Commander. Orbital bombardment can commence at your command. He allowed himself a small smile. This would be over quickly. He turned toward his communication officer. Transmit one final message. The officer nodded, pressing a series of glowing controls. A deep, guttural voice echoed across Earth's networks, hijacking every frequency, every screen, every device. Humans, Varrock's voice growled, you have been given a chance to surrender. Your failure to respond is an act of defiance against the Xelari Empire. Your planet will now be cleansed. You have brought this upon yourselves. A deep silence followed. Then, without warning, the bridge lights flickered. The main display screen glitched, static distorting the planetary view. Varrock frowned. Report, he barked. Minor interference. Commander, the officer responded quickly. It's nothing. But something felt wrong. Proceed with the bombardment, Varrock ordered. Destroy their major cities first. Make an example of them. The Xelari fleet shifted into formation. Their battleships, massive in size, positioned themselves over Earth's most populated regions, targeting systems locked onto cities, New York, London, Tokyo, Beijing. One by one, the targeting computers calculated optimal strike points. Then, everything went dark. The Eternal Dominion shuddered as the lights on the bridge cut out. The holographic displays vanished. The hum of the ship's energy cores stuttered. Across the fleet, the same thing happened. Ships that had hovered like gods above Earth suddenly found themselves blind, unresponsive, and powerless. Commander, one of the officers shouted, we've lost control of the ship. Varrock's heart pounded. What? Power systems are failing. We're locked out of our own controls. Varrock slammed his fist onto the console. That's impossible. What's causing this? Unknown, sir. Our networks are being overridden. Someone is inside our systems. The realization hit him like a plasma bolt to the chest. They had been hacked. But how? These were humans. They didn't possess technology advanced enough to penetrate Xelari cyber defenses. And yet, here they were, shutting down the most powerful fleet in the galaxy as if it were a simple child's puzzle. Panic spread across the bridge. Officers frantically tried to regain control, tapping at unresponsive controls, shouting over each other. The emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie red shadows over the crew. Commander, another officer cried out, we just lost the Iron Fang. A blinding explosion filled the viewport. One of their battleships, the Iron Fang, had vanished in a ball of fire, debris scattering into space. Impossible, Varrock whispered. More ships erupted into flames. One by one, that Xelari warships were picked off, not by enemy fighters, not by planetary weapons, but by something unseen. "Where is the attack coming from?" Varrock bellowed. His sensor officer stared at him, eyes wide with terror. "There's nothing there." A minion took a direct hit. The crew was thrown to the floor, alarms screaming around them. A deep rumble echoed through the ship, metal groaning under the strain. "Damage report," Varrock shouted. "We've been hit, but there's no projectile impact." Another explosion rocked the ship. Varrock barely steadied himself before a new voice crackled over their own communication system, a human voice. "You shouldn't have come here." The bridge fell silent. Every Xelari officer froze. The voice was calm, cold, confident. Varrock's mandibles clenched. "Who is this?" No response. Just static. Then the emergency holograms flickered back to life, but they no longer displayed Xelari battle formations. Instead, they showed something terrifying. Their own fleet, highlighted in red, with the words HFY or eradicated stamped over every ship. "We've lost control of the fleet," a technician whispered, his voice shaking. They own us." Another explosion erupted outside. More ships disappeared. The Xelari were being erased from existence, and they couldn't even see their enemy. "Activate emergency FTL." Varrock roared. "Get us out of here." We can't." An officer stammered. "Our drive is locked. They've shut us down completely." Varrock felt his chest tighten. This was not a battle. This was execution. His mind raced. How had a species so primitive turned the tables this fast? How had they disabled an entire war fleet without firing a single visible shot? Then it hit him. The silence. Humanity hadn't responded to the ultimatum because they weren't desperate. They weren't surrendering. They were waiting, planning, luring them in. This wasn't an invasion. It was a trap. And that Xelari had walked right into it. A final explosion rocked the eternal dominion. The main viewport cracked, and Varrock watched in horror as his remaining fleet vanished into fire and debris. Then one last transmission came through, clear, crisp, and undeniably human. "We warned you." A bright light filled the viewport. The last thing Varrock saw was Earth, spinning silently below, untouched, unbroken. Then everything went black. The silence after the destruction of the Xelari fleet was deafening. The once proud armada, a force that had subjugated countless worlds, was now nothing but burning wreckage orbiting Earth. A fleet that had never known defeat had been reduced to floating debris in a matter of minutes. But the war was not over. The Xelari did not accept failure. They did not retreat. They retaliated. High above the atmosphere, beyond the ruined remains of their first invasion force, the second wave of warships waited in the void of space. Aboard the command dreadnought Wrath of Xel, Supreme Warlord Zorvac seethed with rage as he watched the destruction on his tactical display. He had seen many battles, but never had he witnessed a defeat so absolute, so humiliating. Humanity had not just fought back, they had orchestrated a massacre. The humans must have used deception, one of his officers said, his voice trembling. They must have had assistance. No primitive race could have. "Silence," Zorvac growled, his deep voice shaking the deck beneath them. He turned his burning red eyes toward his subordinates. The first wave was incompetent. They underestimated these creatures. We will not make the same mistake. He turned to his chief strategist. Deploy ground forces immediately. Burn their cities. Crush them beneath our boots. I want their leaders dragged before me in chains. The order was given. Massive troop carriers detached from the dreadnoughts and descended toward Earth's surface like meteors, glowing red-hot as they sliced through the planet's atmosphere. Thousands of Xelari warriors stood ready inside, their weapons charged, their armor gleaming under the crimson interior lights. They expected an easy victory, a swift extermination. They were wrong. The moment the first troop carriers breached the lower atmosphere, they were met with something unexpected. Silence. No human fighter jets, no anti-aircraft fire, no defensive missiles. Nothing. It was as if Earth had given up, as if humanity had already accepted its fate. The Xelari soldiers inside the carriers exchanged glances, some muttering in confusion. This was not how an enemy behaved in the face of an invasion. There was no resistance, no desperate last stand. And then, just as they began to think the battle was already won, the first explosion ripped through the sky. One of the troop carriers vanished in a fiery blast, torn apart midair. Before the Xelari could even react, another was hit, then another. But there were no visible projectiles. Their pilots tried to maneuver, to evade whatever was hunting them, but it was useless. The invisible force continued to pick them off one by one. Inside one of the carriers, a Xelari warrior named Cloaked clutched his rifle, his claws tightening around the weapon as he listened to the terrified voices on the communication channel. "We are under attack. We can't see the enemy. Carrier 17 is down. We're losing." Static. Then, only the screams remained. Cloaked felt his stomach twist. This was no battle. This was a slaughter. But how? How were the humans doing this? The pilot shouted over the comms, "Brace for impact. We've lost control." The carrier slammed into the ground, throwing Cloaked forward. He barely had time to register what was happening before the doors were ripped open and the battlefield came into view. It was a nightmare. The landing zone had been a trap. Craters littered the ground, smoke billowing from the remains of Xelari vehicles. Burning wreckage stretched across the landscape. Soldiers stumbled out of their transports, weapons raised, scanning desperately for the enemy. But they saw nothing. Then the first shots rang out. Xelari warriors fell like collapsing statues, their bodies riddled with holes. The survivors took cover, but the bullets never stopped. From the darkness of ruined buildings, from the shadows of crumbling streets, the humans struck mercilessly. The Xelari's superior armor meant nothing. Their advanced weapons meant nothing. They couldn't fight an enemy they couldn't see. Then a new horror emerged. The air shimmered, and figures stepped out of nothingness, their forms appearing as if they had materialized from thin air. Cloaked human soldiers. Cloaked's eyes widened in shock. Stealth technology. But that was impossible. No primitive species should have been able to develop such advanced cloaking systems. The humans had not just adapted to the war, they had evolved beyond what the Xelari had ever thought possible. He barely had time to react before a blade sliced through his comrade's throat. The warrior beside him gurgled, eyes wide in disbelief as he collapsed, lifeless. The humans were not just using ranged weapons. They were closing the distance, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat. Cloaked turned, raising his rifle, only to feel a cold barrel press against the back of his skull. A human voice, calm and deadly, whispered behind him. "Drop it." His claws trembled, but he obeyed. Slowly, he raised his hands, his twin hearts pounding. He knew now. They had underestimated the humans once. And now, they would pay the price. Across the battlefield, the Xelari forces crumbled. Some tried to fight, but their weapons were useless against an enemy that refused to stand still. Others attempted to flee, only to be hunted down one by one. And then, as the final blow to their morale, the sky lit up with a terrifying sight. Above them, the second Xelari fleet, thousands of warships, began to explode. The ships, still in orbit, had been hacked just like the first wave. But this time, humanity did not simply disable them. They turned their own weapons against them. Xelari warships fired upon one another, tearing through their own ranks, as if possessed by an unseen force. The few ships that tried to flee were shut down remotely, their engines deactivating mid-flight, leaving them drifting helplessly. The Xelari invasion had become an execution. Back on the ground, Cortal watched in horror as his people fell around him. The human who had spared him now spoke into a small communicator. "It's done," a deep voice answered. "Burn the remains." Before Cortal could even process the meaning of those words, the sky turned white. Orbital bombardment, but not from the Xelari. From the humans. Humanity had taken control of the Xelari fleet, and now they were using it against them. The last thing Cortal saw before the blast consumed him was the human soldier walking away, his voice cold and unwavering. Welcome to hell. The Xelari invasion had not just failed. It had been a trap from the start. The humans had played dead, waiting for their enemies to walk into the slaughter. And the Xelari, blinded by arrogance, had stepped right into it. Now, there was only fire. And in the flames of their destruction, one truth became clear. Humanity was not prey. They were the predators. They had conquered hundreds of planets, enslaved entire species, and wiped out civilizations without a second thought. But now, their mighty war machine was burning. Their fleets, once symbols of absolute power, were nothing more than shattered wreckage drifting through space. Their soldiers, once feared across the stars, were being hunted down like animals. Humanity had done the impossible, but they were not finished. The counteroffensive was just beginning. Far above Earth, in the wreckage-filled void where the Xelari fleet had once held dominance, something stirred. The stolen warships, now under human control, were moving. Systems that had once obeyed Xelari commands now followed the will of their new masters. Humans had not just hacked into their enemy's fleet. They had taken it. On board the Xelari dreadnought Wrath of Sel, Supreme Warlord Zorvak stood motionless, watching the chaos unfold before him. The great empire he had served for decades was collapsing. His warriors were dying in the thousands, slaughtered by an enemy they had once called primitive. "How?" he muttered, his deep voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. His officers, the greatest tacticians in the empire, were paralyzed with fear. The war was no longer just about winning. It was about survival. Then the human voice echoed through their ship's comms once more. "Your fleet belongs to us now." It was the same voice that had haunted them since the first ambush. Cold, emotionless, yet filled with the kind of certainty that only came from absolute dominance. Zorvak's claws dug into the control panel. "They think they can use our own ships against us." He turned to his officers, eyes blazing. "Shut it down. Override the system." We can't," one of them stammered. "They've locked us out." Another screen flickered to life, a tactical display of the battlefield, but it was no longer under Xelari control. The fleet's weapon systems had been hijacked, turrets reprogrammed, targeting systems rewritten. The stolen warships turned toward the remaining Xelari forces and opened fire. The counteroffensive had begun. Xelari warships exploded one after another, torn apart by their own kind. Entire battlecruisers were hacked mid-flight, their engines shutting down, leaving them defenseless against the storm of destruction. In the chaos, one of the Xelari commanders roared over the comms, his voice desperate. "Retreat. We must." The transmission cut off. His ship had been annihilated in a single shot from a dreadnought they had once controlled. Zorvak clenched his fists. He would not die like this. If the humans had hijacked the fleet, then he would take it back. "Deploy all remaining fighters," he ordered. "Cripple the stolen ships. If we can't reclaim them, we destroy them." Across the battlefield, Xelari strike craft launched from their remaining capital ships, streaking toward their own stolen vessels. Swarms of fighters dodged between burning wreckage, their weapons locking onto what they believed were their own warships. They fired, desperate to regain control. And then, The human counterattack arrived. Cloaked ships, unseen and undetected, emerged from the shadows of the wreckage. Human strike teams had infiltrated the battlefield, their own fighters weaving through the Xelari fleet with terrifying precision. The Xelari pilots barely had time to react before they were ripped apart by unseen firepower. One by one, the Xelari squadrons vanished from the battlefield, overwhelmed by an enemy they could not see. Zorvak's eyes widened in horror. This was not just war. This was extermination. He turned toward his navigator. Set course for the nearest hyperspace gate. We must regroup with the Imperial Core Fleet. The officer hesitated. Zorvak snarled, stepping forward. Now. Sir, the officer's voice was weak. They've locked our navigation systems. Zorvak's blood ran cold. He turned to the main view screen, staring out at the battlefield. The humans weren't just fighting back. They were sealing the exits. There was no escape. Then, a new sound filled the bridge. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't weapons fire. It was human laughter. Distorted, metallic, and for the first time, he saw their enemy face to face. A human appeared on the screen, their face partially covered by a high-tech visor, their expression cold and unreadable. The voice that had haunted the Xelari fleet for so long finally had a face. Game over. The ship shook violently, alarms blaring across the bridge. The human on the screen smirked. Fire. The wrath of Xel was torn apart in a single devastating blast. The war should have been over. The Xelari invasion force was shattered. Their warships burned in orbit, their armies were decimated, and their leadership had been wiped out in a matter of days. Humanity had not just survived the onslaught. They had turned the tide of battle and seized victory from the jaws of annihilation. But war is never that simple. The Xelari Empire was vast. The fleet that had attacked Earth was only a fraction of their full strength. Humanity had won a battle, but in doing so, they had painted a target on their backs. The real war was about to begin. Deep in the void of space, far beyond Earth's system, the Imperial Core Fleet of the Xelari prepared for retaliation. This was not just another invasion force. This was the Annihilation Fleet. Thousands of warships, each one 10 times the size of those that had attacked before. The full wrath of the Xelari Empire mobilized against a single planet. Supreme Executor Malrax stood aboard the command ship, his crimson eyes burning with hatred as he watched the battle reports. He had seen what had happened to the First Fleet. He had watched the recordings of his warriors being butchered. He had heard the mocking human voice that had hijacked their systems. "This is unacceptable," he growled. The Xelari had ruled for centuries, their military unmatched across the galaxy. No species had ever inflicted such a humiliating defeat upon them. And now, the Emperor himself had given Malrax a single order. Erase Earth from existence. There would be no more underestimating, no more mercy, no more ground wars. The humans had proven themselves to be a threat unlike any the Empire had faced, and threats were to be exterminated. As the massive fleet powered its weapons, preparing for the jump to Earth's system, Malrax issued a final command. "We are not here to conquer. We are here to destroy." Humanity had fought against an invasion before. Now, they would fight against genocide. On Earth, the celebrations had been brief. The world had barely begun to recover when the warning signals blared. Deep space scanners detected the incoming fleet, a force so large that it blotted out the stars. The first invasion had been a test. This was the execution. Inside an underground command bunker, General Ethan Carter stared at the incoming data, his face grim. "We knew this was coming," he muttered, "but I didn't think it would be this fast." Across the room, tactical officers scrambled to find solutions, their voices overlapping in frantic discussion. "We barely have enough forces left to hold the planet. If they launch a full-scale bombardment, we fight." Carter interrupted, his voice steel. He turned to his second-in-command. Mobilize every remaining unit. If this is humanity's last stand, we make it count. The world's remaining defenses were deployed. Every last warship, every last drone, every last soldier was prepared for what was coming. The stolen Xelari ships had been repurposed, their weapons turned against their former masters. Earth was outnumbered, outgunned, but not out of the fight. Then the sky burned red. The Xelari fleet arrived in a single coordinated strike, their weapons firing before their ships had even fully exited hyperspace. Massive energy beams cut through the void, shattering Earth's orbital defenses before they could react. The human fleet fought back with everything it had, but the sheer scale of the enemy forces was overwhelming. One by one, Earth's warships were torn apart, explosions lighting up the darkness like dying stars. The battle in space was already lost. And then the bombardment began. From orbit, the Xelari unleashed hell. Cities vanished in pillars of fire. Entire regions were turned to molten wastelands in seconds. Millions perished within the first hour. The screams of the dying filled the comm channels. He listened. He had fought all his life to protect his people. And now, they were being wiped from existence. No, not yet. Not while there was still breath in his lungs. He turned to his officers. Get me a direct link to the fleet. Seconds later, the surviving human commanders appeared on the holoscreen. Their faces were grim, their eyes filled with the knowledge that this battle was already lost. Carter exhaled sharply. We can't win this fight conventionally. But if we're going down, we're taking them with us. A silence fell over the room. They all knew what he meant. The Doomsday Protocol, one of the officers whispered. It was a last resort, a weapon that had never been tested, a fusion of stolen Xelari technology and human ingenuity, a device designed to tear open the fabric of space itself, to create a black hole powerful enough to consume an entire fleet. If activated, it would not just destroy the Xelari. It would take Earth with it. Carter's voice was steady. If we let them win, humanity dies. If we use this, we make sure they remember us. No one spoke. The choice was already made. Activate the device. Deep beneath the ruins of what was once Earth's most advanced research facility, machines hummed to life. Power levels surged beyond safe limits. The air itself seemed to tremble. And then, the sky split open. A swirling vortex of darkness erupted from Earth's surface, stretching toward the heavens like a claw. The Xelari fleet hesitated for the first time. Their sensors screamed warnings. The gravitational field around Earth was destabilizing. And then the pull began. Warships veered off course, dragged toward the growing singularity. Malraxa's eyes widened in horror. What have they done? The humans had chosen obliteration over surrender. Xelari ships collapsed inward, crumpled like paper as they were pulled into the event horizon. Entire battlecruisers vanished in an instant, their forms stretching, distorting, then disappearing. The Xelari had come to erase humanity. Instead, humanity had erased them. But the price was too high. On the surface, Carter stood outside the bunker, looking up at the swirling abyss in the sky. The world was breaking apart. The ground cracked beneath his feet. Entire continents pulled upward as the singularity devoured everything. This was the end. But as he stood there, watching the enemy's mightiest fleet be torn from existence, he smiled. They had lost Earth, but they had won the war. His radio crackled. A voice, faint but alive. This is Commander Hayes. Our evacuation ships made it out. We have survivors. Carter exhaled a shaky breath. Good. Not all was lost. Humanity would endure. And the Xelari